And welcome to Policy and Practice, adapting to new cannabis norms in the workplace. Naturally, this is a hot topic. It's highly debated, and I don't foresee it going away anytime soon. So, whether you're in a legalized state, the reality is one day we may all be there. And so, it's more about how it is that we can prepare and protect our workforce and our workplaces. So, our goal today is really not just to speak to the challenge, but also understand what it is that we can really do in terms of solutions that really work in the modern day workforce. So, in case we haven't met, my name is Holly Foxworth. I'm a registered nurse. I am the marketing manager for content here, and we have brought in an entire team for you today. We have the team from Hound Labs, we also have Axiom, and then we also have Ogletree as well represented. So before we introduce all of them, let's get you acquainted to kind of what your surroundings are here. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a blue box that would be there. And so that is our next webinar. It's Advanced OSHA Reporting and Record Keeping Workshop, and that's going to be led by Dr. Scott Cherry. So one of the unique things about that is that we'll not only go through the reporting and record keeping aspect, but we're also going to go through some options that you have to minimize some of those unfavorable outcomes with second opinions, with physician written opinions, et cetera. So you definitely don't want to miss that. The way that you get signed up, just simply click that box. You don't have to enter any additional information. That will get your seat reserved, and we would love to see you there. As always, these are recorded, and so they will be available 24 hours after this event today. So we will send you out a copy in the event that you wanted to watch it or share the full event. You can share by link. There's also something on our YouTube account as well. But I did want to ask you guys for your help. I need a favor. And there's two ways that I want you to interact with us. And so the first one is that you should see some emojis that are located there on your screen. And so if you would either use the thumbs up or the heart shape, what that does is that tells us that we said something that resonates with you. And so by using that button, then we take that clip and we can share that with your colleagues, because if it mattered to them and if it mattered to you and it got your attention, then it probably also matters to them and would be really helpful. So anything that you can do there would be great. So we love those clips. The other, and this is my favorite one, is the Q&A box. And so that's the first place that I go when I look to send gifts after these events. And so I hope that you'll ask as many questions as you can think of. And by the way, this is a judgment-free zone. I'm given the topic today. So if you need to ask for a friend, ask for a colleague, you prefer we not use your name, whatever your question may be, we completely get it and we understand. So nothing's off limits, but there's no reason why we can't also have a little bit of fun while we're learning today. So that being said, let's go ahead and introduce our panel. And we'll start with Dara first, and then we will move on to the Hound Lab team and then finish up with Tay. Dara?
Wonderful. Thank you, Holly. And I'm really excited to be here. My name is Dara Wheeler. I'm Axiom's Chief Marketing Officer and over product. And it's definitely an interesting topic, so I'm excited to get going. I'll go ahead and put it over to Sammy and the team at Hound Labs.
Thanks, Dara. Sammy Dabbs here. I am Hound Labs Chief Revenue Officer, and I have spent my career in the employment screening industry and the last 4 years at Hound Labs talking about cannabis and balancing safety and fairness. So really excited to present today some voice of the customer feedback that we've been getting from the marketplace. And I'll kick it over to Tamana, my colleague at Hound.
Thank you, Sammy. Hi, everyone. So Tamana Prasher, I am the Chief Operating Officer with Hound Labs. I've been with the organization for about 20 months and was brought in to be able to scale a product that we have helped the science team get to commercialization. And so I'm excited to walk you through some data as to how the product performs, but also walk you through how the product functions. I've spent the majority of my career all in operations and supply chain roles, really scaling businesses and adding value. Tay, I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic.
Thanks, everybody. And I am the lawyer, so why. So I'm Tay Phillips. I'm a labor and employment attorney at Ogletree Deakins. We're, I guess, technically international labor and employment firms. We've got offices kind of here, there, and everywhere. And also have the maybe notoriety, but also claim to fame of being involved in one of the first really big landmark medical marijuana employment cases. And so I've sort of grown up through the topic from an employment standpoint. And I think that having grown up through the topic, it's been very fascinating to see the evolution of how employers have dealt with it and as employers have tried to find ways to combat it. So happy to be here and hope we can help you all today.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining today. And I think that the audience is really going to appreciate what you have to share. We're going to go to our first poll question. We're going to ask several. I think there's actually a total of 3, but we'll ask the poll question here. And then as it relates to the slide, then we'll get to see your answers and you can compare those with your colleagues that are also here. So the first one that we have is, how prepared do you feel like your workplace is to adapt to changing cannabis laws? So what do you feel like you're very prepared, somewhat prepared, or not prepared at all? And don't worry, we're not sending this back to your employer. So please feel free to put your honest answers in however you feel about that. While you're doing that, in terms of discussion topics, and just give you an idea of where we're going to go today, we're going to go through substance use. We're going to talk about cannabis accessibility. We're going to go through the testing trends, really look at that employer impact, the new technology, which I know is what you guys are excited to hear about. And then we're also going to go through some policy best practices. So I am going to turn it over to Dara and this interesting slide that we have here and let you just tell us what these things have in common. Is this related to influence?
Thanks, Holly. She set me up for this one. So I actually want to push this back to the audience. What do you all think this group has in common? It's interesting. So, throw into the chat or the Q&A what you think this group has in common. Love to see some of the audience participate. And just as a reminder, we love questions and comments from all of you. And Holly really does send out gifts afterwards. We can't promise they're going to be related to the topic of this webinar, but we're definitely going to send some out. We've got some answers coming in. Ooh. Advocates or their users. I think one of the things that is a lot of them, they may or may not be users. We definitely have there's some interesting things there in the pop media culture, but a lot of this group is also started cannabis companies and brands as well. And so we are definitely seeing some shifts in the United States from a cultural perspective on some of the state legalization, but then also what that means from a branding and product perspective. So I'm not going to get myself in any trouble here. So Holly, I'll pass it back to you.
I will say though that when you say that the celebrity piece of this really does have an influence on their culture, would you guys agree with that?
Absolutely. Definitely more discussed in mainstream culture than we've seen in a long time.
Yeah. All of these have some great answers too. You guys have put in some good ones. I'm really impressed. We even had some that said, let's see, the majority were about smoking, which that was the correct answer, but way to go on that one. You guys did a great job. All right, our next poll question is, has your organization experienced a noticeable change in drug testing positivity rates in the last 5 years? So yes, I've noticed an increase. Yes, I've noticed a decrease, or no, we haven't noticed a change at all. So there's no right or wrong answer there. Just let us know what your thoughts are, and then we'll share with your colleagues as well there. Sammy, I'm going to turn to you and let's talk about our growing access to legal cannabis here.
Thanks, Holly. As Dara mentioned, we are in a cannabis culture. There is certainly more access, more acceptability to cannabis. As you see on this map, there's much more green than white. What we're hearing in the marketplace is the tipping point has arrived. It's no longer practical to have a completely zero tolerance policy where you're testing for cannabis with past use. We also hear a lot of cannabis exhaustion, having state-by-state policies as employers. And really, how do you mitigate workplace risk and balance that with safety in the workplace? I think there's a few factors really driving employers to look for additional solutions. And one of them certainly are the laws, right? Legal cannabis and those employer protections. So Tay, I'll kind of hand it over to you to talk about maybe some states at a high level where you're seeing more trends as you're talking to employers as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sammy. So I think there's two different ways of answering that. So if you just look at the map in front of you, I think some of the next states that we've started to see legislation arise and meander its way through state legislatures are some of your white states, right? So white on the map. So South Carolina, North Carolina, I think both of those states have a pretty strong likelihood of passing medical marijuana laws this year. Kentucky already passed a law that goes into effect January of next year. So I think that, a lot of these states that have been typically and historically more conservative are going to start changing, and we're starting to see those legislative efforts arise in those states. We've also seen some of the current, again, air quotes, more liberal states like Pennsylvania start to talk about recreational marijuana laws. So as far as what's in the hopper, I would say South Carolina, North Carolina with medical laws, and then Pennsylvania with a recreational law. And then I think it's very important, and we may be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but not reflected just in this map is really the big tipping point, which is the states that have started to put into place protections or prohibitions against certain types of marijuana testing altogether. And so California is the big marquee state that recently implemented certain types of marijuana. So I think that would be another trend that we would start to set, but I think that would be a trend that you would expect to see, sort of in a left to right march in terms of your states.
Absolutely. Tay, do you want to go into the Schedule 1 and Schedule 3 specifically? It seems like there's been a lot of misinformation about some of that.
Yeah, that's, I try not to read newspapers because it's kind of pointless in the first. But if any of you have heard, so there might be, and I say might because I think it's appropriate to say might, there might be a change on the horizon with the scheduling of marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act. So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, pun maybe intended, about some of the science behind what all these different schedules mean. But currently, marijuana is on Schedule 1, which is, for lay people, the worst schedule to be on in terms of the Controlled Substance Act. Basically means that there is no accepted medical use or benefit for the substances that are found on that schedule. And so there are efforts to move that from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. All right. And just to be abundantly clear, that is not going to legalize marijuana under federal law. I think a lot of people think that if it's not on Schedule 1, then it's no longer illegal under federal law. That is not true. So it will still be technically, air quotes, federally illegal, even if it gets moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. But what I've been trying to tell employers, because I think this is much more pertinent for employers, is it is not going to change any of the challenges that come along with complying with the state marijuana legalization laws. And it's not going to change the challenge with complying with some of your other separate but related laws that are sometimes triggered with marijuana positive tests. And by those, I mean laws like disability discrimination laws, lawful off-duty conduct laws. So I've tried to just bottom line it to employers and say, kind of ignore all of this scheduling stuff, right? It's important for other reasons. It's important for reasons like you're going to have some FDA oversight. It's important for like research purposes. It's important for reasons that have really nothing to do with employment. And so when I've been talking to employers, I try and just tell them it's irrelevant, frankly, for employment purposes. And I know that's being way oversimplistic, but I think for purposes of this presentation, everybody on this webinar needs to just kind of ignore the scheduling issue because it doesn't have any impact on the challenges in the workplace. And in fact, it may make it harder because I do think there may be an incorrect inclination from employers who think that that it is federally legal, and there could be, perhaps some missteps with that. So I know that was a very roundabout answer, Holly, to say ignore this, but I think that's the correct thing to tell lawyers.
I agree. I agree. Yeah. We have had a lot of questions that are coming in that are asking specifically about, is cannabis still illegal at the federal level? What more would you like to?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is yes, it is currently, and yes, it will be, even if it moves to Schedule 3.
Good, good. Let's see. We have so many questions. You guys are asking some excellent questions that are coming through here.
Yeah, and I guess let me say that, Holly. So there's a lot of questions I see in the chat.
Yeah, this is fantastic.
That are like only like solely employment related issues.
Yeah,
I promise you, if we can figure out some way to just get all of those questions in like a spreadsheet or something, I'll answer all of them. It may take a little bit of time. I will answer all of them.
There was somebody that was asking what an example of a Schedule 3 would be, if you have an answer to that, T.
What is a Schedule 3 drug currently? I'm gonna have to hang on. Let me look at Google. Ketamine. Ketamine is a Schedule 3 drug.
All right. Okay. Well, Daryl, let's talk about. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Did you have? No? Okay. Maybe I was just hearing something in the background. Dara, I'm going to come to you next, and let's kind of talk about the reasons why people are using in the first place. And are you noticing any trends there? What do these numbers tell us, and what should we be looking for?
Yeah, funny enough, even my first slide where I said I was going to avoid talking too much about the A-list celebrities, but somebody asked in the chat if Snoop had recently announced that he was no longer going to be using, and I'd heard the term Cali sober recently, which I thought was entertaining, where, it's like instead of alcohol use and sobriety around total sobriety, it was alcohol, giving up alcohol, but still continuing to use marijuana. And so some of the top reasons here for use of marijuana have been listed as relaxation, stress relief, and reducing anxiety, which is really interesting. So by far, relaxation and stress relief are the two highest responses. And it's interesting because those of you that follow us or participated in a lot of our webinars know that we talk a lot about mental health and mental health challenges in the workplace. And so if you're seeing, and we don't necessarily say that you're seeing an increase in diagnosable conditions, but we are seeing an increase of individuals in the workplace talking about stress and anxiety, not necessarily raising to the level of a diagnosable condition. But it's really interesting to see that these are the same reasons that people are turning potentially to marijuana use in general. And so when we think about the ability to manage some of these components, then we are starting to see the use of, and I think this isn't a new thing, but the use of marijuana happen more often as a component of potentially alleviating some of these other stressors within somebody's work and professional life or personal life. So we also track things like, we actually screen employees that come in for injuries for things like stress and anxiety over time and fatigue. And we are starting to see some increases in some of those scores and the way that they respond and some of the stressors that we're seeing in the workplace, or at least people are starting to talk about it more. As one of our psychologists that we work with, Dr. Kerte, would say it's not necessarily new issues, but maybe we're talking about them more. And employees in traditionally heavy industries that we work with, like oil and gas and construction and transportation, maybe they're just talking about it more than they used to in the past. The stigma is starting to decrease, although I think it's still quite alive. But we are seeing through the screenings that we're doing, people definitely asking for more help or trying to get ways to get support in the workplace. And so this relationship between marijuana use and other drug or alcohol use and as a component of relaxation stress relief is interesting.
So I'll ask the Helm team. You know, it seemed like that we saw an increase significantly whenever the pandemic was going on. Do you feel like that there's still those same stressors? Or are you still seeing that in the results that you guys are seeing, that has continued, or has there been some changes in the trends there?
I think we're definitely seeing more employers take a different approach on cannabis testing in general, right? I think it's the overarching thought from the market is zero tolerance, and a zero tolerance policy is not really practical any longer. Employees want to use it medicinally. Employees are legally allowed to use it recreationally in certain states. So how do we balance all of these things in an environment and a workplace drug testing environment with all of these different factors, with tight labor market implications? There's all these forces that are coming together and causing employers to look for a different approach, like a breath test.
Absolutely. Well, if you were wondering what your results or how your results compared to the others, here's what we have. So has your organization experienced a notable change in drug testing positivity rates in the last year? So it's kind of split. It looks like kind of split there. So 54% said no change, and 45.5% said that there was an increase. It makes you wonder whether that's because there's less testing being done, or whether there's just less use. And I have a feeling it may be just less testing being done. Would you guys agree with that?
I would. I think when you look at some of the information that Dara is going to be presenting next on the Quest DTI, Quest regularly also reports out employers that are removing cannabis from their drug testing panel, right? They're not testing for it anymore, so you're not seeing that positivity because of that. So I think that's also a factor as you look at statistics, is employers have said, like I said earlier, I'm exhausted by these state-by-state policies. Yeah. How do we comply with each state? We're just going to remove it. I think that's putting your head in the sand now that there are solutions available that are out there. We have to mitigate that and balance safety, because that's paramount in our workplaces.
For sure. Well, Dara, speaking of Dara, let's talk about some of these testing trends and what we're seeing. It looks like that we're at a high there.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up a little bit, Sammy. I think that it's definitely interesting. If we see testing rates going down, but we are seeing positivity rates increasing overall. So this information from Quest shows a 25-year high in positivity rates, and a pretty decent increase in year over year. And so the interesting thing, though, when you look at safety sensitive roles, and some of this is hard to see, we'll share with anybody who wants links to the data, but you're seeing increases in positivity rates in safety sensitive roles. And I know a lot of you have started to ask questions about safety sensitive roles or certain positions, federally mandated positions like truck drivers, DOT regulated components, and we'll definitely dig into all of that. And there's a very interesting, there's been a lot of questions about zero tolerance and these rates, but safety sensitive positions, for those of you that don't know, these are roles that are considered and labeled safety sensitive because there's some component of the role that is at risk, and so where the employee could be at risk if they're not operating safely. Although I think generally those of us on this call feel like every role in some ways has safety sensitive components, because when we look at even thought workers, and we work with a lot of nurses and people sitting at a desk, there's still a component of safety because we're working in a support of healthcare and employees, and our people need to be thinking of the ability to think and be coherent at the job. So even if you're not in a what we would call deemed a safety sensitive role, thinking about job duties and your ability to manage your job duties appropriately is a big component of what we're going to be talking about.
Absolutely. Darren, we've had a lot of questions that have came in about specifically what safety sensitive is, and would that apply to drivers? Could you expand upon that just a little bit further?
There's a lot of different designations around categories of safety sensitive. Some of this is regulated. So there are regulated roles that have specific requirements that are medical and testing requirements. So if you are a truck driver who's driving a certain type of truck over a certain weight and have to be within that category under the DOT. And I'm probably, Tay and Sammy and the team can probably jump in here more than I can, but that role is a federally regulated role in terms of the requirements, the medical requirements for the job. And so even if that employee lives in the state of Colorado and only operates within the state of Colorado, but may on occasion cross state lines, these are federally regulated roles, and there are testing requirements, pre-employment. There's random testing requirements and post-incident testing requirements, as well as potentially reasonable suspicion. So there's a lot of different roles that require regular testing and medical clearance. And then safety sensitive as a category, it just is a kind of a more loose and broad category, but it means that there are components of a job description that have to require an employee to pay attention to certain safety requirements. It's a very kind of generally used category. Tay and Sammy could probably get more specific than that.
I'll add a little bit, and Tay, feel free to jump in as well, as I think it's really important as employers that safety and HR are partnering together to determine who has safety sensitive job functions. Many of these state laws, as Tay will tell you, he's the lawyer in the room, I'm not, as he will tell you, they have safety sensitive carve outs in some states for your population. So defining that in their job description in advance of that employee coming on board is really, really important. Tay, I'll let you elaborate on that a bit as well.
Yeah, so real quick on the DOT side. So if it is a DOT regulated driver, and that is more complicated than just the surface level description I just gave it. But if it's a DOT regulated driver, then all of these marijuana legalization laws and the employment protections that are contained within them are essentially irrelevant. You can ignore them. But when we're talking about just garden variety safety sensitive, to Sammy's point, these marijuana legalization laws, they vary greatly from state to state. Some states have safety sensitive job exemptions or carve outs, some do not. Sometimes the safety sensitive definition within those carve outs are well defined, sometimes they're not. And then even if there is an exemption or a carve out for a safety sensitive job within a marijuana law, there might not be in some other laws like disability laws or off-duty conduct laws. And so I always tell clients, you should think about what your jobs are, and if they're safety sensitive or not, you should designate them as such if they are. I encourage clients not to spend too much mental energy on what is or is not a safety sensitive job. There probably is a legal definition that is very ambiguous. So just use common sense. If it is a common sense safety sensitive job, then it is. If you're having to talk yourself into it being safety sensitive, then it's probably not. But I think that you should do that homework and get your house in order to identify what jobs are and make sure you are designating them appropriately in your job descriptions or internally, however you designate your jobs.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, there was another question that was asking, that was a legal question I was asking. Are there legal ramifications for discrimination in random testing of non-DOT safety sensitive roles, but not testing others who are considered safety sensitive or not considered safety sensitive? So is there a different standard there in terms of discrimination?
So here's the thing. You can choose to test different groups of individuals differently. Whether that means that you're testing some groups for marijuana and you're not testing others, whether that means you're testing some groups in certain circumstances like random testing, for example, and not others. As long as you're treating groups of individuals, and by groups I mean like business units or departments, as long as everybody within a defined unit is being treated the same, then there shouldn't be a discrimination issue. So, for example, if we're going to decide that we're not a accounting department in a random drug test manner, then all of the people in the accounting department needs to be treated the same. Mm-hmm. But if you want to treat the accounting department one way and we want to treat the forklift operators in a different way, that's fine. You just need to treat everyone the same within these defined groups or units within, whether it be a facility or a location, whatever the case may be.
Understandable.
That's not so
Good.
much a pot issue. It is more so just like a garden variety discrimination issue.
Yeah. Dara, I was going to ask you about, was there any specific industries that these tests seem to be higher in that you recall?
Oh, I mean, again, it's so job description specific typically, not necessarily industry. I mean, of course, there's certain industries that have, if you're in a transportation industry, likely you're going to be dealing with some sort of regulation. But it's very job description specific to Tay's point, and we do the same whenever we talk to clients. It's very much like, let's do this very practically, in terms of the types of requirements, whether they're heavy job requirements in terms of lifting and or physical demands, or whether they're medium or light. So you can kind of create these buckets and categories, and that's where you tend to, because of some of the requirements around the heavier physical demand categories, is where you end up with some of either the regulated roles or certain requirements for a job duty.
Mm-hmm. And one last question on this while we're talking about the testing results here. You know, it looks like there's some big differences between when you look at the positivity rates for pre-employment versus post-accident there. So is it your belief that it could be that maybe they had not used whenever they got the job and then they started using? Do you think that it's because of the legalization? What are some of your thoughts about that?
I have a thought.
Yeah, go for it.
Employers are removing testing for cannabis at pre-employment. And so you see those pre-employment numbers not as high. Again, I think it's really important for all the employers on this call to understand removing it from pre-employment is going to cause things on the back end. You see that post-accident positivity rising year over year. It's because if you remove it from the front end, you don't have a deterrence program within your workplace drug testing program. How do you continue to deter employees from showing up, having used recently, and causing an incident on the workplace? So I think that's one of the reasons. I don't know, Dara, if you have any other thoughts on that as well.
No, I totally agree. And I think let's dig into that a little bit on some of these next slides, because I think that's kind of the meat of what we're talking about here.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, Tay, well, first let's go to the here's how we compare. So how prepared do you feel that your workplace is to adapt to changing cannabis laws? Very prepared was only 8%, not prepared at all, 29.9%, and somewhat prepared, 62.2%. Tay, would you say that this is kind of what you're seeing on your end and the Hound Lab team as well?
So I trust when you put this up. The correct answer for every employer on this call is not prepared. I promise you, because I spend way too much time talking to clients about this every day. And so I admire those to whom you believe you're prepared. You're probably not. I admire you who think you're sort of prepared. You may sort of be, but you're not somewhat. I promise you the correct answer was not prepared at all.
Okay. We're going to move on then to the Assembly bill and let you have this one, Tay, if you'll start us out and kind of talk to us what this means for employers.
Yeah, so this is the law that I sort of foreshadowed a little bit earlier, and I will just go ahead and say this is the single most difficult law that has passed involving marijuana in the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And I'm gonna try and overly bottom line it without saying too legalistic of an answer. There are 2 prohibitions within this law, all right? And it's very important that you understand, everybody on the call, that there are 2 separate prohibitions in the law, all right? Prohibition number 1 is that employers are prohibited from taking adverse action, meaning firing, demoting, suspending, whatever, adverse action based against individuals who test positive for marijuana if the test detects marijuana metabolites. All right, so let me say it again. You are prohibited from taking adverse action if the marijuana drug test to which you administered detects marijuana metabolites. And Sammy and her team can explain that a little bit better than I can. But there is a testing restriction component to the law. All right, so that's problem number one is you've now lost the ability to use like 90% of the different types of tests that are on the market. All right, so that's problem one. Prohibition number two, and this is the prohibition that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, but it is the one that is the most important because it's going to be the hardest one to deal with, is there is a separate prohibition that essentially says employers are prohibited from taking adverse action against individuals based upon off-duty conduct. So if you are smoking weed at your apartment on a Sunday afternoon, that is off-duty conduct. And so there are two protections, two prohibitions, and it needs to be very, very clear for employers that even if you can solve the compliant test piece of this law, you still have to worry about the off-duty conduct piece of the law. And very well into Sammy's piece of this. That is why recent use and recent detection, detection of recent use is so critical, because that off-duty conduct protection is going to be the one that's the hardest to deal with.
Gotcha. Hey, there was also a question that had came in that was specific for you, and it was an anonymous question that said, in states where recreational or marijuana laws exist, when safety-sensitive carve-outs do not exist, and that safety-sensitive non-DOT designated employees or non-safety sensitive designated employees is tested under the for-cause and test positive for THC, are there legal ramifications for terminating them for a positive THC under the for-cause testing? I know that was a mouthful.
Yeah, so, I'll give you a short answer.
Okay.
It might be.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and here's why, right? And this is where employers all the time, they get so caught up in the marijuana laws and the testing and this and that they forget that employment law claims are very often driven by facts. And so there are tons of factual circumstances that could create legal risks based upon the scenario that was posed there. And they could be disability claim risks in cases involving a medical marijuana card holder. There could be off-duty conduct risks if we are in a state that has a lawful off-duty conduct law. There could be potential claims that arise under the marijuana laws themselves. And so I hate to give it sort of a flippant answer, but the answer is probably, and it depends.
Right. And it depends.
And that's why, again, I'm teeing Sammy back up here. What I tell employers all the time is the biggest thing that you need to try and accomplish if you're an employer is you have to create facts that dissuades claims from being filed against you.
Ooh, good point.
The facts that avoid the claims, all right? So if you can create a very strong set of facts, then it's going to help you to defend or avoid claims. And that's where, again, going right back to teeing Sammy up, that's why recent detection is so important, because you create a really good set of facts if you can hone in on recent detection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sammy, was there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to highlight just to that question that was posed. It also depends, to Tay's point, what specimen type are you using to detect cannabis use? And we'll go through those different specimen types and their detection windows in the next couple slides. But I think to Tay's point, it plays into what specimen you're using to detect cannabis and how long of past use you are detecting in that situation.
Okay. One question Samantha had asked was, are these prohibitions applicable to all states or specific to only certain states? There was one that also asked, is this only California?
So this law in particular is only for California. However, there was another law in Washington that was similar, not as restrictive, but similar. I cannot remember the number. It was maybe 5123 or 5125, something like that. But there was a similar law that also went into effect in Washington. And again, going back to the map, you tend to see a left to right march with a lot of these laws. And so California, Washington, take a guess as to what the next states would be that would pass similar laws. I think we could all predict with pretty good certainty the Colorados of the world, the Oregons of the world, the Nevadas of the world, and so on and so forth. But this law, Assembly Bill 2188, is only for California. But just know that there's a similar law in Washington, and there probably will be more as we go along.
Okay.
And there's many states, Holly, that have employment protections. So just because this protection is very specific to eliminating urine and hair for non-DOT, doesn't mean that the state of Illinois doesn't have very strong employment protections in favor of the employee in regards to cannabis. So it's really important to look at each of the legislations and each of the laws that you're doing business in, because each state has very specific language.
Excellent points. Excellent points there. Let's go to our next question, which is, which policy approach do you believe is the most effective for managing cannabis use in the workplace? So the answers are zero tolerance, impairment-based, deterrence, or psychological safety. And this one, you can choose more than one answer if you would like to. But we're going to go through the answers to those here shortly. All right. And then let's talk through employer impact.
Yeah, I'll start and let you all jump in. I don't know if we just lost Holly. Maybe we did. So the employer impact here, when we think about this, is definitely something when you think about how to manage policy around recruitment, retention, and wrongful termination risk. I think, Tay and Sammy just spoke to that really, really well. A lot of employers have started to modify policies, but I do think, to Tay's point, even if your employer is in the process of modifying policy or working towards it, they're probably behind, or maybe still working through how to handle these different components. But some big names that are in the news right now that have started to modify policies around drug testing have been Amazon, AutoNation, Caesars, the CIA, and some of the federal groups have started to change their approaches to testing, which is really interesting. So when you think about that, they've started to modify policies and or dropping marijuana from employee drug testing programs. But I do think there's this landscape is interesting because in so many ways it's starting to change the way we think about policy. And a lot of experts like Sammy and the team, when we talk about impairment, I think the concept of impairment on the job, when you start using the parallel to alcohol, it makes a really clear parallel when you think about something that's federally legal, like alcohol, however, does cause impairment when used. It's this concept of trying to understand how to test for current impairment versus, past use, or like we said, on the weekend use. So when you think about modifying policy to completely remove a substance that can cause impairment, that's really interesting. And I think in some ways, and to Tay's point, we kind of swing different directions across the country, but in some ways it's like we may be overcorrecting a little bit in some of these policies, and we may come back to somewhere that ends up mirroring much more closely to alcohol. Now, Sammy and the Hound Labs team, I think, have something unique in the way they detect impairment. So that's, I think, a big part of this is historically we haven't had a great way to detect current impairment of marijuana use or cannabis use. So that's something I know Sammy will dig into here. I don't know if the group wanted to comment at all about recruitment or retention.
Yeah, I think, and we'll talk more about impairment maybe on the next couple of slides here, and some thoughts I have about impairment testing in the workplace. But from a recruitment retention perspective, what we're hearing in the marketplace, I have clients all the time that are calling, talking to our reps and saying, hey, we had a hiring event and we told them we were testing for cannabis, and I had 55 of the 60 individuals not show up for that hiring event, and the rest of the individuals tested positive in their urine drug test. So with tight labor market considerations, HR, safety, legal compliance teams, they're all kind of in this dichotomy to figure out what is the right fit for purpose in our drug testing program. HR wants to retain employees, safety wants to keep their workplace safe, and legal and compliance, general counsels, and Tay, you talk to them all the time, they're like, okay, if we keep testing for urine, are we at risk in testing in these states? And so I think it's really all three angles coming to a head.
Yeah, and I think that's the difficulty with this whole topic, really at the end of the day for employers, is you've got these different stakeholders, to Sammy's point, and everybody has their own opinion, not only workplace opinion, but frankly, like personal opinions as well. And I think that you've got all of these different moving parts. And that's why I think that if you can have a solution that checks everybody's boxes, then that is the business centric solution, right? Because at the end of the day, right, employers need to find out what's best for their business. And I think if you can find those solutions, or the solution that helps to check everybody's box, whether it be recruiting, retention, safety, et cetera, then, you know, you've kind of hit the jackpot, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, Sammy, I'm going to come to you next. And actually, we had a question that is specific to this. David Martinez had asked, if we can't use urine and hair, what alternatives are there? So talk to us about what other options there are that are available.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one thing before we get started on this slide is one of the number one questions we get is, do you detect impairment? Can you determine impairment from your solution? And the answer is everyone's on a universal search for an impairment standard, and there is not one yet. There's no universal impairment standard across the US. So no matter whatever marketing information you get from other companies as well, no one can detect impairment. All right, so I think that's first and foremost. What we do for detection on THC and breath is we are very, very recent use. We isolate workday recent use. So let's talk about these different specimen type categories. Hair drug testing detects up to 3 months. So that's known in our industry as the lifestyle test. Most employers are using hair testing, if they're using it, really around that pre-employment timeframe. They want to know what type of employee they are hiring on in their workplace. Urine drug testing has been considered for years as the gold standard. Why? Department of Transportation has accepted urine drug testing. So majority of drug testing today is done in urine drug testing. Cannabis in urine stays about 1 month from a detection window perspective. And then we look at oral fluid. So oral fluid detects up to 72 hours. There are some new guidelines out there for DOT potentially, accepting oral fluid in the laboratories, rolling that out. That'll take some time to happen for DOT modalities. But oral fluid up to 72 hours. So something that someone did on their own time, off-duty use, likely still to be positive in oral fluid, to Tay's earlier point. THC in breath only stays about this 3-hour window. So those are the different specimen types. To your earlier point, Holly, and Tamana's going to dig in on the data to the 3-hour window as well. But is there any other questions on detection window and specimen types that I can go ahead and answer?
I was looking, it looked like there was one about what about oral THC usage versus smoking in terms of recent to detection. It was saying breath doesn't do recent use, urine, blood, hair, but what about oral fluids? I don't know if
so oral fluid, cannabis detection window and oral fluid is up to 72 hours. So on this slide here, 72 hours.
Okay. And the other question was, does testing the breath detect edibles?
So we have done some preliminary studies on edibles, and we do detect for edibles as well as smoked cannabis.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to Tamana and let her tell us all about the breath test study and some of the science behind the magic here.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we have used our product and run a number of IRB approved, meaning Independent Review Board approved clinical studies. And one of those studies was where we brought in a certain number of subjects, and we asked those subjects to abstain from any form of cannabis consumption for up to 12 hours prior to our study starting. And then we brought these subjects in and we did what we call is a pre-smoke breath collection as well as an oral fluid collection. Once they had done that pre-smoke, we said, please go out and consume cannabis in a smoked manner. We'd also done a survey that indicated the most common form of consumption of cannabis is smoked cannabis. And hence we had them smoke. And once they smoked, every hour on the hour, up to 6 hours, we basically collected both a breath collection as well as we did an oral fluid collection. And the data was very interesting. In the case of a breath collection, at a pre-smoke, we had a 0% positivity for the detection of THC. However, for oral fluid, 70% of subjects taking an oral fluid sample at pre-smoke rendered a positive. Our detection window then for overall breath from 15 minutes up to an hour was 100% of subjects were positive for THC or cannabis detection up to 1 hour. And by the time that the subjects got to the 6-hour mark, we had 0% positivity at 6 hours. However, differently, for oral fluid, 95% of subjects were still positive at the 6-hour mark. Now, what's really different, one of the key differentiating factors is obviously our detection window of being up to 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours post-smoke as compared to oral fluid. But we are detecting in the picograms per mil as compared to oral fluid that's detecting at the nanograms per mil. So we are about 500 times more sensitive as compared to oral fluid. That difference in sensitivity really allows us to then hone in on our detection window. It also allows us to greatly minimize any false positives or negatives that you can see with our test as compared to oral fluid as described in this study.
Gotcha. Okay. There were several questions that had came in that were asking specifically about oral fluids there. Rachel was asking what oral fluid is. Would that be a CBD type of oil?
Yeah, so oral fluid in this example is actually a saliva-based test that is used for comparative purposes.
Okay, okay. And then there was also a question that was asking about whether that would determine, is there a similar testing data for edibles?
So we are doing an extensive study for edibles with a partner of ours, UCSF, in fact. And so we've done small studies, like Sammy has mentioned, where we do confirm our detection. However, a larger study will be done in partnership with UCSF. One of the reasons for that is primarily because of the amount of dosage that we are looking at essentially requires greater controls that we as a organization aren't able to provide. So we need to be able to do a partnership to be able to get that study done.
Okay, okay. Well, let's talk about some best practices. I know we're coming up to the end here. We'll talk about technology and then best practices. Sammy, I think you're going to cover this one as well. Or I'm sorry, Tamana, you had this one if you wanted to talk about
I'll go ahead and start this off, and I'm sure Sammy can add additional context as well. So for our product, right, the main purpose of our product is to be able to detect as well as deter in the usage of cannabis. And I'll walk through how our product works, but our product has essentially a base station, which is the equipment that you see on the screen. And then it has 2 cartridges. And the cartridges are there to be able to collect not only donor breath, but also a sample from the air environment as well. As far as that base station, it's got a simple touch screen display that guides the collector through the different process steps to be able to collect both the air sample as well as the donor sample. We have an electronic chain of custody format, and we've got a direct integration with Quest Diagnostics. We also use a standard ultra-sensitive LCMS processing, and that standard is what many different drugs of abuse use as well for the purposes of detecting or reporting THC results. Our cartridge, which I'll hold up over here, we are able to collect the breath in this cartridge, and we essentially are preserving that breath sample within the cartridge. That cartridge is then what is sent off to Quest for detection purposes, and a result is reported within a time frame as agreed upon with Quest as well. We provide, right, our tests can be used for multiple different scenarios. So be it random, be it drug, be it post-incident, reasonable suspicion, or pre-employment. And it can service many different industries that we've gotten a ton of interest with for our products specifically.
Awesome. And then we have our policy, we have our poll question, the results here, and we're going to go through all of those individually. I think that would many of you agree that especially the impairment base, some of the deterrent psychological safety, that's exactly where you need to be putting the majority of your efforts? Yeah. Speak to us then about some of the best policies then. Dara, if you want to take the psychological safety, you want to take that piece and then we'll go from there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like Tay would probably say, always consult with your attorneys and your teams. Definitely we're giving some general best practice guidelines, but all of you have very specific industries and scenarios that please get support from experts in this. And I know we could definitely point you all in some directions. Psychological safety, the policy process around encouraging psychological safety is important just because making sure that employees feel safe at work. And that's on both sides. So it's feeling safe in your off time and then being able to come to work, but then also knowing that the other employees around you are there and are not impaired necessarily and are going to support you in the workplace. Those are both components that are really important from a psychological safety standpoint.
And Tamana, how about the fair to all parties?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the challenges that we like to address is really, we talk about safety and fairness, and that's really the core to our brand promise. When you think about the use of our test appropriately, and I run an operations site here. So for me, what's super critical is to make sure that what folks choose to do on their own personal time off is not an item that they are discriminated against. And from a fairness perspective, if I choose to be able to use last night, when I come in the next morning, and if I'm chosen as a random, our breathalyzer allows us to ensure that those individuals have the appropriate detection window as determined by the presence of THC by our studies. And that's really where we like to be able to emphasize the importance of fairness.
Awesome. Sammy, you want to take the last two that are there about the zero tolerance policies and the focus on deterrence versus impairment?
Yes, absolutely. So reconsidering those zero tolerance policies, as we talked about that state map and all of these states that have different laws that are competing against potentially some priorities within your organization, is trying to figure out what is the right fit for purpose for the specimen type that you're using today. Is it the breath test versus these other specimen modalities? And the focus on deterrence versus impairment, I'll leave the audience here with some statistics. We just did a recent survey of 500 plus individuals who said they use cannabis at or before work. 53% of those employees use daily at or before work. Over half are using at or before work. 48% of them said they are using on the job during a break or while they are working. So deterrence, deterrence, deterrence. How are you deterring your employee population from showing up having used recently and causing an incident? So that's what I'll leave you with from my vantage point on that focus on a deterrence program.
Awesome. Well, guys, you have asked some amazing questions, and we're going to follow up with you individually to whether that's from our team or whether it's a Hound Lab team, et cetera. We'll make for sure that we get you some answers. If you haven't already, please make for sure that you click that button at the top of your screen to get registered for the next event. Again, we appreciate all of your questions, and we hope that you've enjoyed spending time with us as much as we have with you, and hopefully you walked away with some additional information that to make your workplaces safer. So thank you again. Have a great day.